So let's cover the branches of the subclavian artery. This is going to be a very simplistic drawing. Hopefully, this clears up a lot of the confusion that surrounds the subclavian artery. So first thing I'm going to note is look at these branches, understand where the branches go. Big thing to note is what arteries branch off of other arteries. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a simple red line. And that simple red line is going to represent the subclavian artery. Remember that the subclavian artery is going to be the continuation of the brachiocephalic trunk after the brachiocephalic trunk branches off and gives off the common carotid artery. First thing we're going to note is that we're going to have a descending branch that's going to travel down into the thoracic cavity. Now, I've already kind of given it away. It's going to travel internally in the thoracic cavity. Therefore, it's going to be called the internal thoracic artery. Real nice and simple. The rest of the branches are going to branch off superiorly because that's what's going to provide blood to my neck and other scapular structures as well. So one thing to note here is that we're going to have a couple branches, and we're going to kind of talk about very briefly. One is going to be the thyrocervical trunk. Now remember, when we see the word trunk, what we should know is that it's going to branch off into many other branches. If you remember, the word common means that the structure is going to bifurcate or is going to split into two. Trunk means I'm going to have several other branches off of it. Now, big thing to note here is you've seen me label this first branch the thyrocervical trunk. If you look in Netter's, one picture in Netter shows the thyrocervical trunk more proximal than the vertebral artery, and another picture shows the vertebral artery more proximal to the thyrocervical trunk. I'm not going to get very picky. Know that both the vertebral artery and the thyrocervical trunk come off of the subclavian artery, okay, because obviously there's going to be some variation. We're going to label the vertebral artery here. Know that the vertebral artery is going to continue on. It's going to ascend through the transverse foramen in the cervical spine, and it's going to provide blood to the posterior structures such as the cerebellum, occipital lobe, and it's going to connect into a network of blood supply to the brain as well. Off of the thyrocervical trunk, we're going to have several branches. And what I like to do is we're going to draw each of those branches. We're going to have one coming off going to an anterior structure. I'm going to erase that real fast. That was not good. And we're going to see an inferior thyroid artery. And we're going to have two coming off to posterior structures. One's going to be the transverse cervical, and the other is going to be suprascapular. After the thyroid cervical trunk gives off this inferior thyroid artery, the rest of it's going to be called the ascending cervical artery. So those are the branches off my thyroid cervical trunk: transverse cervical, suprascapular, inferior thyroid, ascending cervical. The next big branch I'm going to see off of my subclavian artery is going to be this branch called the costocervical trunk. Costocervical trunk is going to give off two main branches. It's going to give off something called the supreme intercostal. And intercostal just means between the ribs. And it's also going to give off something called the deep cervical. From there, we have one more branch to do, and that's going to be my dorsal scapular. So that's a very, very simplistic schematic of the branches off of my subclavian artery. My suggestion is that you watch the video, draw it with me, and then start practicing drawing it on your own, going through and verbalizing the exact same process that I did, because it's a very good way to learn it.